Hello. So this paper titled Globalization and Cultural Hegemony, the case of Marakkapile Theyyangal, was presented at a seminar at MG University, Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam in 2006. So today, 15 years after, I don't know if it is still relevant or if it is of any use to research scholars as well as students of literature and culture. But I think I'll just read it. Okay, you can find out for yourself. This is a brief paper, so I'll read it at normal speed, and you can try to make something out of it. Right. So here it is. Globalization and Cultural Hegemony. The case of Marakkapile Theyyangal. Any discussion on globalization invariably leads to a discussion of cultural hegemony. The cultural hegemony of the West, particularly of the United States of America. Globalization is depicted as a destructive force which takes upon itself the mission of wiping out marginalized cultures to create a unique cultural world. There is an invariable counterposing of Western and non-Western marginalized cultures in such discussions. We often have such discussions. It's generally stated that there is something called Western cultural hegemony, which can be resisted only by invoking the vitality of indigenous cultures. So I can particularly recommend this article by Jeanette Armstrong, a First Nation Canadian writer and activist, on the effects of globalization on her Okanagan community. This can be taken as a symptomatic instance. There are a number of issues which such a discussion throws up. The first is, what constitutes culture? What exactly is this thing that you call culture? The second, whether cultural hegemony is in itself an agenda of the processes of globalization, past and present, or whether it is incidental to economic and political hegemony. A third question, perhaps the most important one, is whether tolerance to cultural practices of marginalized communities is advantageous to the economic forces of liberalization. The predominant view of culture today limits the signification of the word to works of art, customs, rituals, food, dress, and the micro-politics of everyday exchanges, including the use of language. The economic life of a community seldom figures in discussions on culture, in quotes, although it does when the more inclusive term civilization is used, but always with reference to ancient peoples. Thus, one scarcely hears of the British destruction of Indian culture, when the British colonial policies which completely destroyed India's world-renowned cloth manufacturing industry are mentioned. We talk about the destruction of India's cottage industries by British colonialism, by the East India Company first, and then later on by the direct British administration. But we never discuss it as a destruction of Indian culture. Now, that is the point. So, discussions again on China's Cultural Revolution of 1966-76. They do not talk about whether it is, they often talk about whether the revolution was cultural, whether it actually stuck to the conventional description of cultural revolution. Okay. This has been discussed countless times, so I'm not going into that now, but the question is, I think, relevant. What is culture? What do you call a cultural revolution or cultural hegemony, right? So that aside, let's go into other things. Stephen Greenblatt, who is often called the guru of new historicism, reports of his being wonderstruck, standing wonderstruck before a Coca-Cola stand near an archaeological site at a place called Coba in Mexico, where the ruins of Mayan culture were being excavated. He was actually amazed by the Mayan archaeological principles employed in the construction of this stand. Okay, it was actually an ad for Coca-Cola. Greenblatt writes with apparent excitement, okay, like the same kind of excitement that you find in many new historicist writers, thinkers, and philosophers. Okay, if you want to call them philosophers. So this is what Greenblatt wrote. Despite frequent colonial attempts to drive them out or imagine them out of existence, the Maya have not in fact vanished, and a single entrepreneur's architectural improvisation suddenly had more resonance for me than the mounds of the lost city. So they were looking for this lost city of the Mayans. The thunderously loud resonance lost on Greenblatt is the appropriation of Mayan culture by global capital. So this resonance is lost on him. He's talking about resonance all the time. So this obvious resonance, and with anybody who has a good ear, a pair of ears can hear. This is lost on Greenblatt, unfortunately. So to inquire whether anything of the Mayan economic practices have survived in modern Mexico would, of course, be asking too much. What has struck this author as a more significant revival or survival of a cultural practice can be observed in many hotels in Kerala, especially in the rural areas of Malabar. Most hotels serve fish curry along with rice. Okay, you also have the vegetable curry, sambar and the like, but you also have fish curry. Most restaurants serve both. But except in the branded hotels, which are a class by themselves, only the early customers get pieces of fish with their curry. The rest having to be satisfied with the gravy that you get. While all of them pay the same for the lunch. Right. So it's also not unusual that customers are surprised by generous helpings of fish sometimes, especially when there is a lull in custom. Sometimes when there is a hartal or a strike on, when the shops are partially open, so you get plenty of fish. The curry was prepared for a larger number of people, then they didn't turn up. So the restaurant owner is generous with the helpings of fish, right? So this happens quite often. So this practice has survived the onslaught of global capital. You find this still in rural restaurants, and of course, in globalized times there is no free lunch. So the corollary is that there is no free fish either, but you get it all the time in rural restaurants in Malabar. So giving the customers worth for their money or more, right? So John Ralston Saul notes that the entire thrust of the present globalization movement, which began in the early 70s, was in making economics a religion, and that it completely ignored cultural diversity as a factor which had to be reckoned with. One can find that when it got around to dealing with cultural diversity in Europe, multiculturalism was adopted as a policy. For instance, take the European Union. So in the European Union, the documents, whatever documents are presented at a conference or circulated among officialdom or among the people, are translated, available in fact, in 27 languages by the last count. Probably there are more languages available. but 27 languages, documents in all 27 languages of the European Union, spoken by the people in the countries which are part of the European Union. So here you are, okay, an accommodative policy, multiculturalism. Not you don't have the domination of major languages like English, Spanish, French or German. You have all the 27 languages. You have very small languages like Finnish, spoken by less than 5 million people. So here is multiculturalism for you, right? So people are encouraged to learn more languages. This is also part of the globalized drive. You have interfaces in many languages on social media, for example, Facebook. It's possible to type in several languages, more than 100 languages on Facebook. And there was a case of an American president trying to learn Hindi. I don't know if he was serious, but George Bush definitely looked as he was serious about his Hindi, right? So this happens all the time, and multinational companies spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for translating their documents into languages other than the 6 languages recognized by the United Nations. So, English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Russian, etc. So, multinational companies don't stop at those languages. They try to get translations in as many languages as possible, where they have sizable number of people buying their products and services. There you go. So you have interesting ads. You find Amir Khan hauling up bottles of Coca-Cola from a village well for girls who are definitely his admirers and probably admirers of global capital as well. So you find a Parda-clad woman speaking enthusiastically about the latest brand of washing machine recently introduced in the market. So what we can probably sum up is that money speaks the same language the world over. So as long as the cash counters are kept ringing, cultural relativity can be accommodated, or more importantly, cultural diversity can be exploited. Okay, turning things on their head. Okay, so instead of destroying cultural diversity can be preserved, protected, and used, exploited rather. So it may also be possible to measure the economic success of globalizations of the past in terms of tolerance of marginalized culture. Quite possible. In fact, European colonial empires from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries can be taken as symptomatic instances. Okay, so one of the reasons why British imperialism was more successful, British colonialism was more successful than their French, Spanish or Portuguese counterparts, is that it was certainly more tolerant to indigenous cultures. Okay, you can think of the proclamation of Queen Victoria in 1858, immediately after the first Indian War of Independence, okay, which nearly pushed out British colonialism from India. So Victoria very precisely said in a proclamation that India's cultural practices will not be interfered with. Okay, the British administration will not meddle with India's religions or cultures. A very important statement which has often gone unnoticed. So this hands-off policy paid off. Okay, there no more banning of sati, no more banning of child marriage, nothing. Bentinck actually was a very sincere cultural colonizer. Okay, So unlike Pentic, the Governor Generals or the Viceroys who came after 1858 never attempted that. Although, for names, there was no missionary activity either endorsed by the British. Of course, although missionaries were present in parts of the empire, they were not patronized by the British. So, here you are. Now, all these are actually prefatory statements to a more or less casual look at a novel in Malayalam, Ambikasuthan Mangad'd's Marakkappile Theyyangal. So this brings into perspective, one can say, for the first time in Malayalam literature, the dynamics of economics and culture in a community over which you can use a cliche, the juggernaut of global capital is rolling in. Okay, the phalanx, if you want to be more European in your language. So the epilogue of the novel, it actually sets the tone for the ambiguous positions towards cultural traditions the narration takes the reader to. So the narrator, with a bachelor's degree in literature, owns a drugstore in town. It's called Lawrence. His friend Lawrence, his classmate in college, had become an activist by this time, organizing residents of this locality called Marakkappu against the projects of the tourism department. Okay, Marakkappile beach rather. It's basically a fishing community which lives in this place. So this project is funded by global capital. That's the most significant part of this novel, where the people are taking on global capital. It looks like people are taking on global capital in this struggle for cyberware. So this project actually would destroy the original environment of the place. Okay, it will shut out fishing entirely. Okay, and the fishing community is for that reason at the forefront of the agitation. Although people who live inland have also joined them. Okay, for the fisher folk, this is actually a threat to their livelihood. So Lawrence is, of course, tracked by the district administration, and when he is murdered, the needle of suspicion, to use a jargon, points to the district administration, which is very enthusiastically following the developments. Okay, once the project is initiated. So Lawrence's death takes the narrator on a journey of inquiry. Okay, he's on a mission. He wants to find out what's happening in this place called Marakkappu and its inhabitants. So he goes on a journey, and as he returns from his first visit to Marakkappu, it is already night, and he hears strains of Thotram, the hymns for the Theyyams, from a temple in the distance, not at Marakkappu, but at some place, some distance from the place. So this actually sends him on a nostalgic reverie. This is very important. This nostalgic reverie that always surfaces when you sense or smell a threat to your culture, what you call your culture, right? So the narration alternates between valorization of the indigenous culture and its incisive critique. This also happens. So within the narrative, there is also a critique of the indigenous culture that surfaces. These totems are for the Theyyams, who are actually dead men or women returning as spirits and then transformed into gods. Okay, they call this process is called Deification, process of turning people or other beings, animals, anything to a god. So this double focused narration actually This creates, on the one hand, nostalgia, and on the other, anguish. So the Theyyams appear on the ramparts of the Kambalur fort. So they are not the kind of fierce, demoniac entities depicted in performances by traditional artists. No way. They often laugh wryly at their own marginalization. This is very interesting. Okay, so it's a group of very weak Theyyams. Okay, frustrated, desperate Theyyams who appear on the ramparts of the fort. Okay, so they lament their fate. So they also watch the project unfolding before their eyes. Okay, so the Theyyams are in fact not the kind of entities that we used to seeing in fiction or in cinema. Okay, they are more conscious of almost human, you can say. Gods who are almost human. So in between you have passages that parody the canonized novel in Malayalam, Chemmi by Thagazhi Shankar Pilla, available in many Indian languages besides foreign languages like English. Of course, English is not a foreign language, but Russian, Czech, and quite a few other languages. I think in Arabic also. So Chemmin is, parts of Chemmin is are invoked in this narration. So there are, of course, such narrations often invoke a certain kind of pristine innocence of indigenous cultures. Here, any such illusion, any such group of illusions about the pristine innocence of indigenous cultures are shattered very early in the novel, when both children and grown-ups rail at a run-down European tourist couple at the beach. Okay, so it's not innocence; it's just intolerance to other cultures. Yeah. So your idea of innocence of indigenous people, okay, their generosity, their well-being, okay, their humanity, all these illusions are destroyed in this early part of the novel. Okay, you don't rail at, you don't throw stones at foreigners who don't look like you, right? So later on, the widow's bath ritual, which the heroine Umbichi is forced to take after her husband's death. So this demonstrates that tribal or semi-tribal cultures can be as ruthlessly patriarchal as any other. I think this has been deliberately inserted into the novel. The Theyyams prove powerless, as can be expected, to stop the appropriation of the fishing community's land. Lawrence's death was a setback for the movement, which resisted appropriation of land for tourist project, and from which the movement could not recover. Lawrence's death was a permanent a blow to the movement, something which almost spelled its, which sounded its death knell. So bulldozers demolished the huts, and the whole community is uprooted. The tourist resort takes over the ghost town. It's a ghost town. There are no inhabitants. Everybody has left or have been forced to live. But when the novel ends, there is consolation for historians of culture who exult in the survival of cultural icons of marginalized communities. Okay, all those Stephen Greenblatts, local Stephen Greenblatts, you have something to exult over, or if not exult, at least be comforted over. Every structure in the tourist resort is built in traditional architectural design. There is a small wood in the resort, even a wood, okay, and a wood that has been artificially grown, in which trees and medicinal herbs native to the Western Ghats grow in abundance. Here you are. If you want indigenous cultures, we'll make it for you, right? So there is also a theatre in the complex, built in the traditional style of a Kootambalam. This is another story altogether. How this indigenous culture is no more an indigenous culture. It has already been appropriated by a Savarna cultural paradigm as represented by this Kootambalam. People had never seen a Kootambalam probably in this locality. Certainly not the fishing community. So in this Kootambalam, Theyyam artists performed every evening. I don't know how these two things go together. A Kootambalam and Theyyam. Well, it's an eerie world where culture has survived as a commodity, but not the people who created it, much like what Greenblatt saw in Mexico at the site of excavation, where the Coca-Cola stand was there, but not the Mayans. I don't think they live in this part of the world anymore. Of course, you still find them in Central America. It's another thing altogether. So this truculence of this designer breaks down when one of the artists throws down his drum and breaks into tears. This is an important event in the novel. Okay, although they have been incorporated, they have been drawn into the matrix of global capital, they still can't adjust. Okay, there is this initial stage when there is a nostalgia for the past. There is a certain repugnance which manifests itself in such isolated protests, okay, or breakdowns as you have it. This artist who throws down his drum and breaks into tears. So the novelist could not allow global capital to have the last laugh, okay, at least in his imaginary world, okay. Even if global capital wins, has its last laugh outside, not in my novel, the novelist seems to say. So let me end this essay with a question. Okay, I don't know if it's a question. Was Stephen Greenblatt, like many intellectuals today, being an apologist for global capital without realizing it when he exulted in the survival of Mayan architecture in the Coca-Cola stand? Thank you.